Today, no demo. I'm two demos behind in documenting them, videoing them, putting comments in, and so on. The one on the two queue managers and Docker containers, and last week's that I also want to supply some answers to. I haven't got around to get the answers, but also to video that call. So I've made an initial recording of that, and I'm not happy with it, so I'm going to have to redo it. Then next week, we at this point in time, our RPA guy Lloyd is committed to doing me a demo and a short presentation on RPA, robotic process automation. If you're interested in that field, maybe you want to send an invite to some of your colleagues as well. So that's it's technology. I don't know. It's more the young people that plays with things, I think, in my opinion. And then, please note this meeting is been recorded. So the one thing that those of you that know me for a long time knows that I started my initial career with IBM in 1995. And since then, I've always been involved in MQ, and then from 1999 with WebSphere Message Broker Integrator in those days. So I've always played in the integration field, whether I was working for IBM or not, working for myself, working for a business partner. And the one advantage that I received from doing a few different things out there, but always in the same field, was that I've seen lots and lots and lots of implementations of how people are trying to do integration. There's lots of successful ones, but also some unsuccessful ones. And there was a time, sort of in 2005 to 2000, maybe 2012, maybe a little bit later than that as well, where patterns and how to do integration was we tried to do some patterns in there so that you can, with absolutely the minimum effort, try and spit out your SOA world for you and make sure that your services is running in the right place. It proved to be was working. But when you get into an upgrade scenario over a few versions, and if you've got lots of endpoints out there and lots of people that needs to change code, maybe it was anti-productive in that area. But there's still a lot of patterns, and we still talk today. There's been books around integration patterns. There's been websites about patterns, and there has been quite a few attempts at trying to make it more formal. But every time, just as we're trying to get it to a slightly more formal stage, something has changed. And lately now, really running your stuff in the cloud and containers and so on has really chucked out a lot of these patterns. And a lot of the old traditional patterns was built around an enterprise services bus. And those of you that's attended some of my sessions around this knows that we believe that the ESB is dead. The functionality encapsulated in that will carry forward, but the ESB as a construct is really dead. That central bus is creating a lot of issues as we go forward, and it really inhibits integration. There was this report from Gartner that they often refer to, from the end of 2018. It says that our traditional integration patterns as we know it is not an enabler anymore. It's now an inhibitor. It was an enabler for a very long time, but technology has moved really fast in the last 5 years. So I would like, if possible at all, this to be a two-way discussion. And if you've got any ideas on this, I'm going to just throw ideas around. I've put this, or I'm busy putting this deck together, and I must admit that again I've had a huge amount of help from Kim Clark, our integration architect in the UK, and he's the father of a lot of these ideas, and he spent his lifetime working around it. So let me have a look. Okay, so I need to just quickly switch my presentation here. So when we do modernization workshops today, we really have a look to say, what is driving modernization to go forward? Because it's not something willy-nilly. You don't get up one day and you say, okay, we're going to modernize our world out there. And sorry guys, I've got the workers in the area, so I just want to make sure they're still okay. So you don't wake up one morning and then you decide that I'm going to modernize, because it's a lot of work, and you really need to think about it very carefully. And there's many different avenues on how you can tackle modernization. But there's really four primary trends driving the integration market today. So we've got the API-led integration. Now, APIs is absolutely exploded in the last 6 or 7 years or so. Initially it was led by the guys like Google and so on, that was publishing APIs that people could use out there. It's quite easy to write even an App Connect enterprise application that goes out a call REST interface in Google, and return for you it's 37 kilometers between 2 points out there. And there's really millions of APIs out there today that you can call. Lots of them fee-based, lots of them not fee-based, and you guys are also creating a massive amount of APIs. We had a stat about maybe sometime last year. I can't remember exactly what it was. So we actually measure how many APIs gets called on the IBM Cloud environment. And it was 30 million API calls every hour at that point in time. I don't know what it is now, but really APIs, the API-led integration is cut across the board, and it's almost like it's a glue that's sitting out there, trying to make it easier for the programmers, and I know we're a lot of programmers on this group, to try and communicate with the back-end systems. There's also an increased need to integrate across hybrid and multi-cloud environment. I think 4 or 5 years ago, many of us were still skeptical about the hybrid cloud. And specifically in South Africa, our latency is sometimes not the best. The hybrid cloud world hasn't taken off as fast as in North America and Europe. That pace, however, is changing now. I see the hybrid cloud, and specifically some of the patterns in how to use the hybrid cloud when there's latency involved, is really picking up space with us as well. We see there was an initial big push of lifting application, dropping them somewhere on a cloud, and that trend is actually reversed. Our customers is taking a lot of stuff that they've lifted and dropped somewhere in the cloud, they're bringing it back on premise. And there's different reasons for that. But one of the biggest reasons in that environment is that if you don't integrate with that kind of world as well, then and our figure shows that somewhere in the region of 40% of applications out there has got this really big need that if integration is not there, don't even try to move it to the cloud. So and then when you start thinking about integration and the patterns around it, it's a lot more than just moving data from on-premise to a database somewhere in the cloud, and then an application will pick it up and do something else with it. I think in certain circumstances we've underestimated the cost of doing things like that. We've underestimated the time of doing it. Security, of course, played a big role as well. And there was a little bit of shaking out of what can be done and what is good patterns of doing that. The third big reason is line of business. Now, line of business in most of our corporates today is really pushing very hard for business to move faster. And we've got really good reasons to say why our integration environment is a blocker. It is inhibiting moving really fast. Business wants to hear answers like, yes, by the end of next week, I can show you the first demo and we'll go in pilot phase 2 weeks from now. Where your traditional integration world, we replace weeks with months or maybe even quarters when we try and move things with traditional integration. So line of business is putting a lot of pressure on integration to move faster. And you remember that I'll try and show you today if we get to it, that long tail of integration. Then the changing application deployment architectures. I think a lot of us now is getting very comfortable with using the new container kind of world. If you talk to IBM, you know, every third word, maybe every second word is OpenShift, OpenShift, and OpenShift. So how to containerize things, I showed you guys a few weeks ago how easy it was to just dump an MQ, just start a new MQ up in a container, and it's true for most of the products out there today. So I chat to my lighty the other day, and you know, he was raving about how easy it is now today. In fact, it was this week, how easy it is now to take the latest version of MQ, dump it on his machine, and just to test something, because it used to be not so easy, let's say about 24 months ago. So these four driving factors is really impacting our world. And what we're trying to also say is that what out there is, and how does these things impact integration patterns? Because every time we say something about a new world, there's an integration pattern that's got an impact out there, and what does it mean on the ground? So let's step back just a little bit. So this was one of the first books I read on integration patterns. It was published in 2003. I think I got my hands on it around 2010. And there's a discussion out there on by specifically Bobby Wolf on what is integration or enterprise integration patterns out there. Of course, these patterns were squarely and firmly inside the SOA world, ESB kind of world. And he had little icons, in the book about everything out there, all kinds of patterns that was identified by them as this is an enterprise pattern for integration. Now, is this practical? Yes or no? But or maybe just a subset of it was practical in your organization. But it's, I think, still a very interesting read to try and understand specifically where enterprise integration patterns is coming from. And guess what? If you're sitting with legacy environments in your organization today, you tend to want to have implemented a lot of these patterns, knowingly or unknowingly, in your world. There's also a website out there. It's called the Enterprise Integration Pattern website. There's a long list of traditional kind of patterns listed out there. Again, the site is, as you can see, it's got a very old style as well and so on. I'm sure it's not been updated for many, many years. But you can still go in there and you can click on every one of these things and say, okay, now, so what is the pattern for a traditional shared database, or what is the pattern for a message channels or for file transfers? And this list goes on quite deep inside into this website. So there's a lot of things to read out there, and there's a lot of things that you can, that's quite old as well, and maybe it doesn't fit with the modern paradigm of how we try to look at integration. And this is part of what I'm talking today, is to say, yes, those patterns were valid. Are they still valid? What do you see in your organization, and so on? We've even had an attempt to have a language with little icons, and you'll see this was a typical IBM backgrounds for slides in the year 2012, where you could represent a request response with an icon like that, or a distribute, or a root, or an enrich, And we've used this for a while, and I think the complexity became a little bit high at one stage, because there's just so many patterns out there, and customers were. I remember like meetings with customers, and some of them was actually on this call, where we were trying to sit down and figure out if I must create a flow, and I can ask myself a set of questions. And then take different lines of new questions depending on the answer from the previous one, almost like a workflow. Will it at the end tell me that I can solve my problem, or I can create a solution by using tooling ABC? And we've tried hard to make it work, and there was lots of discussions and meetings, and there was people that has proposed certain areas of how to do it. and in my opinion, none of them was really successful. And I think part of that was the complexity of what we're trying to do with patents out there as well. So if we look at a subset of some patents out there, so we all know there's some traditional ones like file transfer patterns and shared databases, remote procedure unification, messaging, and so on. But that's very often sitting on quite a high level. But what about patterns for correlation, protocol and transport translation? What about optimistic or pessimistic locking? Is there really a pattern out there on how to do it? Maybe in your organization there's a pattern, but when you lift that and you try to implement it somewhere else, it's a bit fraying at the edges. How do you do a health check for an environment? What about the verb conversion? And we might call about API conversion in today's language out there. I've really lifted a lot of these things from slides that is maybe almost 10 years old. But we recognize the language in here. I remember, how we've designed, architected, and programmed what to do with large objects in IIB. If you receive a large file, how do you analyze that file programmatically, then decide if you can do it record by record, or is it a file transfer, or whatever you can do. Because the moment you pick up a file that is too big and you don't have enough memory, you blow your machine away. And then this is now looking at it from quite a complex, what is all the little nitty gritty things in there, and what tooling do you use to implement some of these patterns out there. And then we try and simplify it again. That's very natural for us humans to try and say, how do we group all of these things together? And even today, if you want to do integration, there's three distinct areas. There's how do I connect to my front end, my back end? There's data coming in from somewhere. I need to expose that interface. Then I need to, do maybe some data manipulation, and there might be some integration logic that goes with that. And these three together, very often, we can build an integration pattern with it. Now, just for a little bit of off topic, if you are willing to do this for me, I'm popping a link in the chat. If you can click on that, it will take you to a short survey out there. And if you can complete the survey for me, maybe it'll give me or us a little bit of insight in what we're trying to do with integration patterns. I just want to see what is your idea about integration patterns. It's a simple list. You don't have to. It's not going to track you. You don't have to give your name or anything. That's optional. So I'll give you a minute or two if you're willing to do that. So in today's modern world, of course, we start talking about IBM Cloud Platform Integration. This group is geared around a lot of the products that's inside here. The basis of integration has maybe moved a little bit. We've got a tooling in IBM that IBM has identified 6 products that's forming the core of our integration product suite out there. You might not agree with all of the products, so you might want to add a few more in there. But we're sitting with messaging and how to change data and security and APIs in the suite. Now, what has changed from a long time ago is now that events is becoming extremely important as well. We're talking about Kafka. What we do see is that a lot of our traditional applications out there that we want to integrate with is still there. We're still talking to the SAPs of the world. We're still talking to our mainframes. And we're still talking to a lot of our on-premise applications out there. But there's also the new kids on the block, there's the whole cloud world, Salesforce, Workday, Box, all of those kind of environments. That is integration points that we want to hit from a very secure and high throughput kind of environment, because that's how we drive our business today. So the integration suite, of course, will play a very important role on integration patterns. Also, cloud back for applications on IBM's side, because we write applications, and it's our applications that is got a need for that integration endpoints out there. So the WASs of the world, application servers, Cabaneros, how do we integrate with our cell phones and pads and so on? I'm sure some of you might even listen to this on your phone. So we need a combination of applications and integrations to actually be able to make sure that we can work in a modern world out there. So from that point of view, we can say, okay, what does an integration pattern in today's world, what does it really look like? From what we do from an integration point of view, we've got three big pillars that we tackle in the integration modernization. We tackle the API economy, we tackle agile integration architecture, and then the event-driven enterprise. Now, the event-driven enterprise, there's lots of very interesting reading on that, and it's really starting to make an impact, specifically when we talk just from a tooling point of view, MQ versus event streams. So where is that going? And then we've been forced down the line to say that we really need to rethink our integration architecture. It's okay to sit there and think that maybe this monolith we've created, 10 years ago, we need to rethink our integration architecture, and the number of moving parts in this is really big today. So we try and rationalize it and start thinking in boxes to say, if I think about an agile integration architecture, what does an agile integration architecture mean for me when I start thinking about integration patterns? Will it throw my traditional integration patterns out of the door? Yes, of course it will. Will it incorporate some of those? Yes, I'm 100% sure it will incorporate some of those as well. So when we start thinking about integration patterns, we need to think about, if we think about a messaging perspective, what is this messaging perspective? What does it mean for my traditional integration patterns? Does it create new patterns? Specifically, if by messaging I mean event streams, something like bulk loading of data, synchronous, asynchronous. Then the API perspective, APIs has already made a dramatic change in our lifestyle today, and how we're using it. What does that mean for integration patterns out there? Does it simplify patterns? Does it complicate patterns? Does it throw patterns out of the door? And then when we start to change data, what is the impact of making these changes work today? We know if we, for instance, move from a monolith environment to a more web services orientated kind of world out there, is that my integration patterns out there will be dramatically different. And how does it impact me as an integration specialist, but also how does it impact the organization that I work for? And think about those first four driving factors I started off with. If that is the driving factors for changing integration, of course that must have a big impact on my patterns as well that I'm going to use. So a very traditional world out there where we're sitting with my systems of record that maybe talk with some messaging environment out there. There's my ACIB layer or my broker layer, and I expose some APIs, with API Connect, of course. And then my engagement applications talk to these APIs now, and maybe some of them has already moved into a microservices kind of world out there. I can also start to add maybe some event streams. How do I feed my 12-factor web services application with data, because it needs to be autonomous out there? And then my exposure gateway to the outside world, and how do I communicate with my business partners, maybe on a more secure or a more reliable kind of link? And then what is the kind of integration patterns I can put in place between myself and my business partner? if I look at the long chain of transactions these days, is that very often when you try to do something, you might hop across quite a few companies to get the job done. SaaS is starting to playing a more and more important role. Very often we just see it as a set of endpoints or APIs that's exposed to us. And then we need to think about, on the left-hand side, if my traditional kind of world out there, a very mature, large enterprise, their integration patterns might look very, very different if I compare it to a greenfield online startup kind of application. And the biggest reason for that is that this layer here of systems of record or legacy very often doesn't exist in these new style companies out there. If you go and read up on how modern web applications is operating, it is a very different style of integration than my traditional kind of integration patterns out there. Do you move between these two? Do you start to, as a corporate, do you start to adopt some of the this kind of integration patterns and try and put it into the corporate? Do we see that our older born on the web applications is actually moving closer to more traditional integration patterns? I don't know. So, but it's something that we need to discuss and see what is the impact for integration patterns, because these two worlds is just so different from a computing point of view. This is a familiar slide to many of you guys out there. It's our integration reference architecture. And we try and view a lot of our integration tooling inside this picture. The shading sort of going towards the right here is not for artistic purposes. It really means that we're taking the monolith that we're running with here and we're trying to break it up into smaller pieces. And it might be an evolutionary process and not a Big Bang kind of process. And in doing that, and of course most of us on this call with integration, we like these dark purple bits. That's where we're spending our time, and we try and make our corporates more efficient. And something that's often overlooked in this slide is that we need to look at the three backplanes here, and we really need to think about synchronous communication, asynchronous communication, as well as bulk communication out there. How does this impact my integration patterns? Is my integration pattern changing as I move towards the right on this slide? And then, of course, it's got to change. If I move to a more cloud way of doing things as I move around, does it change my integration patterns? Yes, of course, it changed my integration pattern. And sometimes it's easy to say, yes, but I can install a queue manager on-premise in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Everything is okay. I can install another queue manager on a cloud somewhere in the world, and that's exactly the same integration pattern. Yes, on a macro level, that might be quite the same integration pattern out there, because, you'll move the data once only format, there's security involved, exactly the same. And the data arrive in a transactional kind of fashion on the other side, and we're making use of a very familiar way of doing our data. It's a very easy way, a pattern to use for integration there. But once the data arrived on the other side, of course, now I'm in a completely different kind of world. Security takes on a new meaning. Latency might play a role. How we communicate with my customers might be a lot more efficient that way, because they're closer to where the application is running. But what about things like, how do I move bulk data to the cloud, so that I don't have to hop back to my on-premise application every time there's a query from a customer that dials into one of my applications that runs on the cloud. Those kind of things puts a slightly different spin on things. We talk to the data architects out there. Data, for as long as I can remember, everybody is striving towards the one view of a customer. There must be one version of the truth out there. Guess what? In this world, there might not be one version of the truth out there, because you need on-premise data and your data distributed over a few clouds out there. So which version is really the version of the truth? It makes for very interesting integration patterns if we start talking on that kind of line. Then when we look at integration and the steps we need to take from your centralized ESB to the decentralized integration ownership kind of world out there where the ESB doesn't exist anymore, is that every time we make a step, is that what is the impact of my integration patterns out there? How does it impact my integration patterns? If I look at for instance, different ways of integrating today, lots of us on this call like to sit in this kind of world here on the left-hand side. We've got tooling that's complex to use. Integration is complex, and our companies are paying us good money to write integrations so that old and new applications, for instance, can talk to each other. There's the shadow IT world out there where lines of business is employing IT people to do integrations for them, iPaaS kind of integrations. They really don't want to wait for these guys for a 6-month or a 1-year project so that they can, move data between a DB2 database and a Google spreadsheet. They want it done in a really short space of time. And then we also see some integration patterns that's been very popular now, where our business user integration is getting involved. There's no IT guy out there. It's really the secretary or the CEO or the senior managers in the organization that quickly wants to do something because they've got an idea and they want to test it out. There's no high-level integration involved in there, but guess what? Because of the distribution of data through most corporates out there, it's extremely difficult to pull data together from one source, a second source, a third source, and then combine them into a unified view. Now, those tools are starting to become very, very easy to use out there. The problem with both of this middle layer and the integration pattern that we use, maybe on the right-hand side, is that if this is successful, in other words, people want to replicate it in the organization, they're going to try and throw it over the fence to the guy sitting over here to say, okay, this is the way we want to work now, please make it work for us. And by the way, put in security, and by the way, make sure this works, and by the way, make sure we distribute all of the answers to everybody in the country. That adds a completely different layer of complexity of what we're trying to do with integration patterns. Do you allow these guys to go out there and create these patterns, yes or no? The multi-cloud challenge is an interesting one. You've got still your traditional on-premise world sitting here. You see this picture from our reference architecture. You've got maybe an iPaaS, iSaaS world that you want to call into, and you've got your private cloud still sitting inside your data center running on OpenShift, of course. But you've got many other cloud platforms that's running out there, whether it's your AWSs, your Azures, your Googles, the IBM clouds. Some is you don't even know where they're sitting in the world out there. And again, very important, the 3 backplanes. You need to communicate between all of these worlds, typically synchronously, asynchronously, as well as in a batch format. And then we can start to talk about what is all of the challenges we find out there in the cloud. Okay, the scope of management. How do I manage it? What does my SaaS integration really mean out there? And every time I tackle any one of these blocks out there, and there might be many more out there, I need to ask myself, how does this impact my integration patterns out there? So integration patterns is been sitting in the middle of a lot of discussions out there, whether we like it or not. And we might push back to people and say, you can't do it like this because of some kind of directive or some kind of architectural rule or some kind of whatever else out there. And guess what? The youngster on the block is going to go behind your back and do it anyway. So how does that impact the integration for our big corporates? How can we get on the bandwagon for many of these things and make things faster so that business can start looking back at integration and says, yes, integration is making things run really fast in my organization? we need to talk about microservices. What is the considerations for microservices out there? There's still a lot of questions, Is it mature enough, How do I do eventual consistency, What is my CPU usage now? How do I track it? If half of my application is running on-premise and the other half of my application is running in a cloud setup in Dublin, how does it impact my integration patterns out there? Does it change these patterns I've worked with for the last few years? Or is it something that I'm feeling uncomfortable when I move away from my pattern? Do we need to ask architects to work again with new integration patterns out there? Because guess what? We want agility, we want scalability, we want resilience. And some of the old patterns is just not going to give that to us. We've got a technical standpoint to say, why do we think microservices is very important today? It's from simple things like maybe 5-6 years ago, if you walk into your organization, you're not always 100% sure if the network is going to be up. These days, you work at home permanently, okay? But if you work in the office and you move home, you expect everything else to just keep on working. Your cell phone needs to kick into the new to the wireless network at home, and if the 5G network is stronger, you need to log into to the 5G one, and you expect your email and your chat applications to just work. Doesn't matter where you are. Now all of those things is a massive push down this complexity structure, where the complexity is getting less and less and less, so that we can do things like this. Our tooling these days, GitHub and Jenkins, and all of the agile things is really a lot more mature than even 5 years ago. Then we also need to really think about, why is microservices very different from SOA? And then as soon as we realize that, we can say, what is the impact then on integration patterns? Okay, if reuse is not my goal with integration today, and by the way, if you do an IIB or an ACE programmer, reuse is one of your biggest goals out there. But if I'm telling you reuse is not your goal anymore, how does it change your pattern of integration? All right, data duplication is embraced. Gee, how many data architects on the group is just had a small heart attack? It's just not something we do out there. We need to look at some modern patterns out there. In other words, can we create truly independent microservices applications out there? If this is my systems of records down here and I've got a microservices 12-factor application running in the cloud somewhere, or even in my on-premise private cloud, how do I move data between those? If I call an API, is this calling in, or will I be allowed to call out as well? Is data sync good enough to move data between my container somewhere in OpenShift and my traditional database? Do I make use of Kafka or event streams to replicate things out there? So you see, it's an integration pattern that evolved over the last 8-9 years, where we say maybe event streams has got a real area of applicability, where we can say this is how we will use it. And the moment you make that words, this is how we will use it, means that, okay, am I creating a pattern here now? How do I document this pattern in my organization? How do I mature this pattern inside my organization? So we need to rethink on different layers. I've got a few minutes left. We need to think about people and process, architecture, technology, and how does all three of those have an impact? Every one of these. If I think about the small squads of people instead of a big center of excellence, has that got an impact on my integration patterns out there or not? If I talk fine-grained deployment, of course that will have an impact on the integration patterns out there. So we need to look at every one of these. What is the impact of microservices when I move into a fine-grained deployment? Okay, do I do all 12 factors for microservices, or is 8 good enough for me at the moment? All right. Of course, how I implement and where I implement things has got a massive impact on my integration patterns out there. Bare metal to virtual machines, most of us is very comfortable with us now. We're moving into the container world, and the no code or function kind of world is just around the corner. This has got a big impact on exactly how we're going to do those integration patterns. Our pipelines, CI/CDs, are getting so mature these days that even complex patterns that we would not even touch, okay, 2 years ago, we can do it now because there's a simple CI/CD pipeline that assures me I get exactly the same delivery every time I push the button with zero human impact in there. And then how do I change my traditional organization? Do I want to change it? On the left-hand side, reuse, quality, and stability might be very important, where on the right-hand side, if I move more to an agile kind of world, then agility, velocity, and autonomy might be a lot more important to my organization. But guess what? I'm not going to flip a switch and make this happen. It's going to be a process over time on how to move there. And do we believe that some of our systems of record will be around for a very long time? Yes, it will be around for a very long time. I think I'm going to stop there because the rest of my slides is going into a little bit more of, what happens in a new kind of world out there. We're at the top of the hour, but I'm more than willing to take some questions or have some discussion points.